chairman is going to be giving the presentation this afternoon, so it's not appropriate that he should introduce himself. So I'm going to. And David, just very briefly, his last job was as general manager in the government sector for Europe and East Africa at IBM. I should also mention that he's a former president of BCS, and he's past master of the IT company. And one of the things he now does, as well as being chair, is that he's trustee of a charity called AbilityNet since its foundation. So David's talk is Bottlenecks and Breakthroughs, a 40-plus year journey in IT.
Thank you.
David.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real delight to see you, and I'm just amazed anyone would be interested in it. It's traditional, apparently, for the chair to present. I came in last year, the last day of the end, and nothing I could say about concerning computers would be worth anything to this audience. I know nothing, except for memories. So in a sense, this is a presentation about memories, but hopefully on the way, a few things that are of interest that have come out of those memories. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, I wondered if this even got inside the rules of this organisation, but fortunately on the website is this paragraph, which says this. So I'm operating under use and history of the industry. So I now feel legitimate, at least. And why now? Well, those who overheard our lunchtime conversations, this might be appropriate. But of course, if we don't talk about these things and record them now, they'll be lost. And so to that extent, it's the same way with computers. And both the history, but in many ways the ideas, and behind the ideas, the things that were enabled by, if you take the machine and you put them in the hands of people who exploited the machines with customers, clients, institutions, the world we know today wouldn't exist. And so some of the projects I'm talking about have those sort of characteristics. And then as my career progresses, you'll see I get further and further away from the technology and more into the managerial stuff that happens to people. I got on that gravy train almost by accident, all completely by accident. But that's what it was. And so one of my theses, which I hope to demonstrate, and I will mention it again, is that the engineering methodologies that are appropriate to systems are just as appropriate to when you start working properly in the evolution and development of large institutions. And I have a sort of example from the computer industry, but it's just to make a point. And I talked about the portable computer. Now, someone actually used this phrase, used the phrase luggable at our lunch today, but it was already in the pitch, I can promise you. And what we're saying here is that if you think of the evolution of the portable computer, however level of portability you like to choose, in the very early days, all these systems elements were there. But we had cathode ray tubes, you had lead acid batteries, we had keyboard or nothing. There were every one of these areas, as part of the system elements, was at different states of evolution, all moving at different points of development. So what happened, time to time, one element would become the bottleneck in terms of the next step. One or two bottlenecks, while being knocked down, to some extent largely remain, like power supply in the portable device. An early breakthrough, in fact the enabling breakthrough, was the flat screen, in my opinion. And my boss was very proud of the suitcase with a minuscule little cathode ray tube he lugged around in the back of his Daimler when he was being driven around when he was chair of IBM. But, to call it a portable today, and then it was more portable than a room full of kit.
More portable than compact.
Exactly, absolutely. Yeah, but so my thesis is that you get these same attributes apply to companies, to projects, to institutions. And the first examples we're going to look at will more dwell on the application, if you like, of this thought. Didn't want to go, excuse me. Still don't want to go. Why is my machine not talking to me? Because it's technology, that's why.
It's taking exception to your...
My rubrics aren't right. It's a bottleneck. Now that's going backwards. Still going backwards. It won't go forward. I was trying to record it, but it's wise to me. Hang on a minute, we'll get there.
Usually space gear is sufficient for forward, isn't it?
It is. Oh, wow. See, this is mine. She doesn't use it for this. It's my wife's, but it's the only way I can get the presentation. So here we are. So this is the agenda I'm going to go through. How did I get into this industry in the first place? I want to pick out some examples of the points I've just raised using the aerospace industry, particularly my experiences with British Aircraft Corporation, and in the banking world, and my experiences there with Lloyds Bank. And they're very much tied up to the industry piece. And then I got, obviously, as you went up the ladder in IBM, IBM as a business has its story as well, some of which are not well known. And I'm going to share some of those. And then the BCS itself, at the point I came into being involved with the management of the BCS. And then finally, and it's a sort of nice, tidy way to tidy it all up, as I hope you'll see, I want to talk about this organisation called AbilityNet. So that's the path we're going to follow. So how did I get into this? Well, I read electrical engineering in Manchester, not the elite down by Elders College, but up the road, in the Faculty of Technology. However, we got our degrees in their hall. We got a bit of fur on our gowns as well. But apart from that, in those days, of course, they were together. They went apart and put back together again now, the wheel turns. But when I left there, I thought I was going to be an electrical engineer. That was sort of reinforced as well, because one of the things I did at the university, I had contemplated possibly a military career, and I'd been part of the Officers Training Corps. And I actually had been commissioned into the Royal Signals TA before I graduated. And that went with me. Down when I went back to London, as a graduate trainee for London Transport, I joined Signal Regiment in Essex, 45th Essex Signal Regiment. But London Transport were accredited by the Institution of Electrical Engineers, in my memory, they accredited courses were appropriate to moving on to professional qualification in the AMI, EE in those days and so on. And so that was a prerequisite if you thought you were going to have an engineering career. And it was very good, the training, I have to say. Not necessarily for what they wanted me to do, but one element which comes back in a sense so useful for me was that after we'd done all the technical stuff and worked around in the Acton Works where they used to rebuild the trains every 5 years or whatever, there were various other departments you'd go and work in. They had to write a report at the end of 8 weeks or whatever to your supervisor about what you'd seen, how it worked, and now it looks like an absurd question, how you thought it might be improved. But in fact, I find myself doing that for money with IBM in the computer world. So that was lucky. That was lucky. Then when I finished being a trainee, I worked on the Victoria Line project. Two main things. One was an issue with the design of axles. You would believe they knew by now, or by then, how to design railway axles. But there were issues with the profiling, especially in questions of managing stress relief. And they had a series of design cases which had to be accelerated by tested, and that was my job. And you had to detect cracks the same way as the doctor now ultrasounds you, looking for your thrombosis or whatever. We were using that technology to try and detect the onset of cracking in railway axles. So that was a job I had to do. Then I was posted to the automatic train control unit, which was testing the automatic train systems. We built literally a miniature automatic railway out on the Hayward Loop on the Central Line. This was great for me because I actually lived in Woodford, I was handing over to works every day to get my training, so I was almost working from home for that one. And that was obviously a very interesting experience. At the end of it, or towards the end of it, someone had this idea that when they built the railway, the urban railway, there were a lot of trade-offs had to make in macro design decisions, things like really the rates of acceleration were the issues that gave you closer train intervals. That uses more power, you get more wear. If you've got closer train intervals, you need more turning platforms at the terminal end. So if you think of Stratford Jubilee Line station, it's one track, there's about 6 platforms to turn the trains around. And that's capital, so they tried to devise ways of looking at the capital expense trade-offs in the design of an urban railway, using the Victoria Line as the example on which to work, because we've got data. And that data was used in a paper to the Ibm Uk, but it was processed on a Leo computer. So my first interaction with a computer was as a user. I was the guy interfacing from the group, getting this stuff all set up and passing it on to the Kids Grove, like it's a bureau basically. So I saw this magnificent tool which collapsed the time element of doing such a project by orders of magnitude. It wasn't just a few weeks, it completely revolutionised the thing. Unfortunately, for me anyway, I was 4th of 4 on the team, young guy, just to come into the organisation. And they said, oh, well, you're too junior to be named on the paper. Now, of course, if you were looking at a professional career, this wasn't exactly exciting because you felt you contributed, as did the team, to be fair. They were very upset about all this. But that was the thing, and so they said, sorry. Now, I sat there and thought, well, that's a bit of a blow in the face. And then secondly, I couldn't see where the next project of this excitement was coming from. After it had taken about 70 years to build a new railway. Of course, Jubilee Line came, but that was still a long way away if you think we're talking the 60s. Also, bizarrely, that's why I mentioned the TA, I had much more responsibility in the TA than I did at work. I was a troop commander, I had 45 people, subaltern under me, 3 sergeants. I mean, it was a job. I had a job in the TA because we were a strategic reserve regiment, which meant we trained our people for a specific role, not just turn up and drink, you know, the Harold Wilson view of the TA before he chopped it to bits. But, so it had a real interest, a real motivation, a real thing. So this put as a catalyst for career change. So here I am, now 26 years old. What am I going to do next? Now, some of you will have seen him, but I have an identical twin brother, literally identical. And of course, it's great havoc, even at our advanced age. Not deliberately, you don't have to deliberately do it, it happens anyway. And he had gone into chartered accountancy. He's a Scottish accountant, slightly different process. The English, we end up in the same place as a fully qualified accountant. Now, unfortunately, in those days, you almost more or less had to pay for the privilege of being trained. I had to support myself on my own, no other support. So I thought, well, this computer thing had been interesting. There was an ad in the paper for a company called IBM, never heard of them. And it said you had to have 5 years postgraduate experience, be, everything that they wanted I hadn't got, so I applied. And they gave me a job. Presumably the recruiter hadn't read the ad, I don't know. But that's how it all started. I moved to IBM because I've been so excited by the capability of this thing that I've worked with as a user, and that's the true story of how it worked. Just a bit about IBM, the IBM I joined. Each of the case studies I'm going to look at, I'm going to tell you the background because it is appropriate. We're talking about a long time ago, and what looks odd now was not necessarily odd at the time because the initial conditions, if you like, were different. IBM, some of you know where there were issues between the US government and IBM on its size, antitrust. And the thing came out by consent, i.e. there was no trials or anything like that. And the big thing that IBM conceded was to move from a It was a rental-based business where you had to offer a mandatory purchase option. Now, one of the little tiny details, and I put it there on purpose, nobody signed, you didn't rent a car like you would at Hertz. You rented IBM machine service. And with that came IBM systems engineers and all the rest packaged. And so the service ethos was incredibly high. And hopefully still is, 20 years since I worked for them. It was very customer focused, very service focused business. And then you got the mandatory purchase option. And that spawned new industries, plug-compatible manufacturers, new service providers, software providers. A great one sitting in the room over there, and a very successful software company. Nice to see you there. So, you've got that going on, and then underlying all this is what I call the commercial impact of Moore's Law. In other words, if things are improving at let's just say 20%, and you want to grow the business at 10%, you've got to keep increasing your install base 30–40% to keep up, to make the business grow. And I've just happened to read, between 1950 and mid-80s, IBM grew in revenue in dollars from 250 million to 50 billion. So somehow they managed to overcome the Moore's laws. But it's really there. And of course, later on in life, it got more and more difficult. We'll probably not have time to go into the sort of corporate planning aspects of that, but it's an issue. And just briefly how it was structured, all the time I was there, certain things are absolutely global. Yorktown, Zurich, the place which gets Nobel Prize winning all this stuff. Globally based development. Now that, I say because the product divisions, as they were called, were all based in the US, but there were offshoots around the world. We'll see more of that later. Manufacturing was by continent. So you didn't want to ship this stuff too far around, so there were manufacturing plants all over Europe, and it was normally a product by plant type of business. But marketing and services, the customer-facing bit, was very much country, because it had to conform to the standards and norms of the country, as well as fit in with, as well as you could with the corporate setup. But they recognised a long before IBM Uk ever started, the need to be as close to being part of a national economic infrastructure as you could. So that's the way it worked. Move on then. Having joined IBM, I started off working for a branch. We were organised by industry. So I was in a branch based in Birmingham, dealing with 4 industrial groups in those days: GKN, Tube Investments, National Coal Board, if you call that a group, it's highly dispersed, and Rolls-Royce. This was pre-1974. Okay, so they're very big customers, that's why it was called the special accounts. I worked mainly on GKN, places dotted around. I needed to come back to London. I was based in Birmingham. I had actually been luckily working on a GKN company in Ealing, it wasn't too bad, installing a machine there. But IBM, I was about to get married, and my wife had a job in Kent, etc., etc. So they moved me to the aerospace marketing unit in Welwyn Garden City branch. And there I was posted to the team working for British Aircraft Corporation initially. And so I just want to talk about a little bit some of the things I observed, and we did there. And remember, we're talking about the 60s still, late 60s, and things weren't like they are now in terms of challenge. There was a quick resume of how BAC formed up, and you will notice a string of companies. Now, an awful lot of large enterprises have been formed by aggregation, some form of acquisition, friendly or otherwise. This gives enormous problems in group management, and hasn't really been solved by most yet. It got worse for British Air when they became BAE, because they then absorbed hawkers. And in the same way you can have a philosophy of anything, there are different philosophies about how you go about aircraft. And inevitably the two partners are different. And so these are challenging environments for management, especially when you're on leading edge projects. And I'll just pick out a couple of things which were BA, this is Commercial Aircraft Division, they were profitable. They had to make money in their own right. It's an important point coming further on. But they were developing really leading edge, first of all, configuration control systems. This is the definition of the aircraft. Now the problem is there are at least 3 aircraft definitions: the as designed, the as built, and as inspected. And there's a 4th one after that, which is the as modified. So, and they're all different. So the more aircraft you sell, the more the data explosion is on all this stuff. So you needed, if we hadn't got even then of what looks rudimentary now, software and database technology, they were using it right to its limit. Okay, and then of course coming along, as we'll see, was another step change in complexity. So the 2 areas, the configuration management and the production planning and control, these were leading edge systems. Without these systems, these would have been show-stopping bottlenecks. It's a classic example of a bottleneck. There was a further problem in that, although the main sites of the Commercial Aircraft Division were Weybridge, and they had an offshoot in Herne, now used for flying, on holiday, etc., EasyJet. The way the parts, the batches went through work processes that could involve travelling around all 3 sites. And to keep track of this was a nightmare. They had no way of doing it. So, and this is why we worked with our client and formed an understanding of their business, and we proposed to them using the very early VDUs, 2260, on the network. As for the process, they used to be called progress chasers. No doubt they're scheduling engineers or something by now, but anyway, they were progress chasers, and there were a lot of them. Because someone was saying, where's my batch? My machine's idle in the machine shop and it's still over the road being fettled or something out of, I don't know, anything like that would happen in manufacturing. And so it was an IBM idea, and one that worked. I'm going to show you some that didn't. I'm not going to claim to be on this. We conceived the virtual factory from a planning point of view. Now you think, well, so not everyone will know that. Not at that time. This concept of virtual anything hadn't arrived. So this was a real breakthrough for reducing costs and basically time as well, because idle machines is costing you money in a machine shop. The whole idea was to put the throughput up through the fixed assets of the manufacturing plant, and don't forget that to sell these things for money, make a profit. And this thing in the main was the BAC 111. And it's the picture of one there. So that was the Weybridge story. Then comes the Concorde, which was, of course, in high stage of development. Now, the Concorde, obviously much more complex than the BAC 111. So the database challenges of configuration management were huge. But it was built, because it's a political aeroplane, on what I'd call a multi-plant philosophy. But the way it was done was modularized, so they had various lead and subcontractors. Normally, the old BAC 111, you'd build the airframe and then you'd fill up the inside with the systems, the hydraulics, the electrics, etc., the control systems. These, because they were political, the units were fitted at the point of manufacture in various places, Toulouse, Bristol, Weybridge, wherever it happened to be. Even Hawker City, they had a contract for that. So these fully fitted modules were made. Now the problem was, you didn't know if they would fit together till you put them in the plant of integration, which was Bristol or Toulouse. So they had a special aircraft that looked like a whale flying on these bits all around Europe. And when you tried to put them together, they didn't fit. I don't think they didn't fit in terms of gauge, but the terminations would be wrong or something like that on a piece of wire. And we thought, gosh, this is costing a fortune. Now really, in a sense, Concorde wasn't being built for money. It was highly subsidised, the whole thing. And so I thought, well, it's fair to save them some money. It's a challenge. And I conceived the idea of having process control computers where you could effectively take sensors or whatever it needed into a process control computer and test the integrity at the other end before you move the unit. Sounded like a good idea to me, but I didn't buy it. So it's one of the things I never managed to sell. It's still a bottleneck. I didn't get a breakthrough. But the relationships we had with these customers was quite remarkable, because we were quite young guys. We're talking about the senior management of high-tech industries. And somehow they listened to us. They didn't buy this one, but they did plenty of others. It was quite bizarre in many ways. But still, so that's examples from the aerospace. And then one more was the rapier, the English Electric. This was at Stevenage. Now this was a catalyst for change. Now, IBM had a scheme where the account team had to go away and look at its customer. By this time I was managing the aerospace unit, 2-3 years after joining, which was an even bigger surprise than me. But I went along with the team, and we went over to Belgium for a week, and at the end of it, there are other aerospace teams from France, Italy, Germany, doing a similar thing, because we were an industry marketing-based approach, and we wanted to learn from each other. And they came to the final presentation, and the Germans came in with their pile of files. The objective, by the way, was to get in front of the chief executive and persuade him we've got something good to tell him. Then the French came in with their file and a book of Rousseau on the top, because they're always like that. And then the Italians came in. I came in with 2 pieces of paper. This is absolutely true. And what I'd done is I'd analysed the various aspects of the business in terms of the technology, the markets, the phase of product, from product entry, mainline production, phase out, product support, etc. Because you get an ever-expanding bandwidth from these operations, true of all technology industries. And by the way, all the early stuff was cost plus. The customer was the Ministry of Defence. In fact, one of the directors said to me, David, to understand us, you have to know we're a charity administered by the Ministry of Defence. Absolutely true quote, couldn't make it up. What I'd sought to do, if you've got 10 minutes in front of the MD of one of these divisions, you're damn lucky. And I just consolidated this on a now and just projecting on obvious grounds what it would look like in 3 years' time. And I didn't get to see him, but the IT director took it to him, and he said no, he was too busy. So, more rejection. However, it wasn't the end of the story. Time came to move on, and the IT director and this guy said, we want to take you out to dinner, and by the way, we want you to bring your division director. That was Peter Moore, because I was and the chap I'm talking about, his name's George Jefferson, who became the first MD of privatised British Telecom. So no slouch as an industrialist. And he said to Peter Moore, he said, I wanted you here because I should have done David's programme. He said, I've been living with the consequences ever since. Partly because there was no one in the organisation who took that view. And the issue, a fundamental issue was, all the new markets, you had to make a profit, because they were export. And the systems you need to make an export are entirely different from when you're just supporting a handout plus 5%. It's obvious when you look back on it, but it hadn't dawned on them until they found they didn't know how to manage this now profit-making part of their product line. And so that was a real, the bottleneck was almost mental, if you like. And so eventually it was a breakthrough for me, though not for them, because I got promoted. And I was taken from aerospace into banking world. And I became branch manager. Now, the IBM branch manager is sort of the lieutenant colonel, regimental commander type. It's a serious business unit with all its elements, if you like. That's a real management job. Everyone wanted to be a branch manager. And I was transported over to the City of London, area I'd never been. I'd worked in Birmingham, I worked in Bristol, Weybridge, Stevenage, different world, very different world. And handed to customers. One was Lloyds Bank worldwide, and the other one was Barclays Bank worldwide. And so, and in fact, in revenue terms, it was the largest branch in the country, and I was the newest branch manager. And they were, of course, in the middle of a revolution. So here's the clearing bank scenario at the time. Decimalisation was finished, which had clearly taken a huge amount of energy. Concepts of countrywide banking were coming in. Any branch would handle every customer. that involved things like branch and more check automation, and the self-service banking, new devices, network explosion, large-scale projects. And I'm convinced one of the reasons I was asked to do this job, one, that I've exhibited the ability to see the dramatic effects of change, and that actually my boss didn't there to see the customer say so. But secondly, this is an engineering project. This was sheer engineering, needing planning, management, control, because as we'll see, it's not done on a stable platform either. So this was, I suspect, why they moved me over there. But it was a great job to get. I'm not going to talk to anything about check automation or Barclays Bank. I'm just going to look at something, true story, from Lloyds, based around the CashPoint project. Now, they did actually trademark CashPoint, so now they're legitimately able to call it CashPoint. Massive rollout, well over 1,000 endpoints, probably a lot more, but about the time I'm talking about. But then there was a spanner in the works, and it was IBM. Because they introduced virtual operating systems, and with that you had to change all the access methods for the network to work in the virtual environment. So how do you upgrade a live customer-facing system without massive disruption in this environment? That was the challenge. Go back to it's a very important part of the IBM ethos. You do anything for a customer, really. And the last thing you do is want to offer him this great leap forward, having trusted you to get this far, that you're going to wreck his program for goodness knows how long. And that was effectively the scenario. So we went over the product division who were responsible for all this. They had a view. You could shut it down as long as it took to get software out and you can open it up again. We weren't prepared to go to our customer. But the ethos of the company was we didn't have to go by what the product division said. So we set about writing a bridging package, which the customer paid for, to be honest, because it wasn't very much money in those days. It was a sort of sideline getting paid for this stuff. I had a team of 6 for 6 months. I got 3 of my people, and I got 3 from the Hursley laboratory who were expert in networking. And the reaction from the corporation, i.e. the product division, was complete horror. Absolute horror. And when they got wind of this, they dragged over to the States. I was the branch manager. Tony Cleaver, some people have heard, was the regional manager, my boss, direct boss. We went over to the States, and they did this in-depth audit. Now, the outcome was, at the end, they had to say it worked. It did work, because these people were very clever, and they didn't want to put the customer in a mess either, because they'd be the ones cleaning it up. So they're highly motivated to get a good solution. And this, we called it Bridgetown. So it was an interface which enabled you to swap protocols transparent between the 2 systems. And it worked. Now, at the end of the discussion on this, the division president was talking to his team, and who said because he needs to hear from them, yes, it works, to clear himself, right? And they said, yes, it works. So we were asked to go, and I was the last out of the room. In fact, I hung about the room because he turned to his team and says, "Can you tell me how 6 goddamn libraries in 6 months have done something we haven't achieved in 2.5 years?" Then he turned to me with a grin like this and said, "Oh, you weren't supposed to hear that." I'm sure I was. But what I'd done here was, in a sense, probably subconsciously playing the IBM game. The IBM game was look after your customer. And I was branch manager, I was responsible, and I couldn't let this happen. So I commissioned this thing. Technology, I contributed nothing. But without me taking the risk, it couldn't have happened. And to be fair, Tony Cleaver knew and supported me. And anyway, it didn't do me any harm. Because the top management in the company, this was what they wanted to hear. You wanted people to take initiatives. So I got a phone call. Be in Paris tomorrow. Mr. Kasani was number 2 in IBM Europe, Middle East, Africa. And I had this interview with him, and he said, "Do you want the job?" I said, "Well, you know, we just got a young child, my wife knows nothing about it, I didn't know what I was coming here for. He said, you've got 24 hours. Very generous. But he's an inspiring guy. He's a superb, probably the best executive I've ever seen or worked for. And in fact, he got to be a vice chairman of the IBM corporate board, the only non-American ever to get that far up by a Swiss guy. Anyway, so there I was rapidly transported over to Europe and East Africa headquarters. The operating unit, IBM Europe, they're the same thing really. Now he was, amongst other things, the line manager for all the large countries, so the people like Nixon, Germany couldn't, Italy couldn't report it to him, and all the others through a pyramid structure. But the real point of this job is it changes your perspective completely. It's a gateway from the branch manager's sort of purview into completely the international management. So I wouldn't have said it was a bottleneck because I guess in a sense, it was a bottleneck I didn't know existed because I don't know, 18 branches and by then 3 regions. So it was probably at least a very much slower pathway forward. And this had the effect of parachuting into this new arena. A bit more about IBM UK that I was part of then. When I came back, there's nothing to tell really in those sort of jobs. We did our job, I learned a lot, IBM Europe carried on. But really, it's not a case study, so I'm moving over there. Back to the UK. Then 18,000 employees roughly. We had manufacturing and development at Hursley, part of this international structure I showed you. 18 branch and regional offices, headquarters at Portsmouth Harbour, and a group subsidiary board structure. I came back to run the London South Eastern region, which is where Tony Cleaver had been as the regional manager of branch offices. And then I was moved to Portsmouth to be director of business plans for IBM Europe Group. I was appointed a director at that time. A lot of companies don't have such a function, but the job of the planning, business planning, was to, in a sense, make a triumvirate between finance and marketing, because there was usually quite an impossible head-off between these organisations. But we knew a lot about the product plans and this sort of stuff. And our job was really volumes management, resource management, investment management. And then and it was our job to take the country plan through Europe, if necessary, though very rarely did you have to go directly to the United States. So that's another completely different role for me, but without having done that job in Europe, it would have been hopeless. So we didn't have the background to do it. But it was really, really exciting. I'm just going to bring out a couple of IBM vignettes, really. This is another one which we nearly got very badly wrong. I'll tell you that now, I'm going to tell you how we nearly got it badly wrong. IBM had a corporate-wide initiative, that's pre-internet, of course, for office systems. And Tony Cleaver, as our operational MD at that time, very keen on being on the leading edge, so commissioned the IT people to come up with a proposal. And what was proposed was, I would say, as traditional, application-rich, with a sort of phased geographic rollout. We just weren't happy. The management team wasn't happy. Something felt wrong, so we asked to go away. And then it's interesting, I mentioned earlier colleague Peter Morgan, by then we were on the same board. And he'd been a role signals officer as well, strange enough. And we said, what they've missed is, this is a communication system. It's not an IT system, it's a communication system. And the rules of communication, there's pervasiveness and all this stuff, making sure it's usable, all this. So we told them to come back with a completely different plan. So of your 20 apps, tell us, as we now call them, tell us the 4 that are most widely used. They're pretty straightforward. There's email, scheduling, document creation and handling, and then access to things like policies, procedures, corporate information, stuff which you needed from time to time. So they were the 4. And they were told then, running out in a year. If you don't do it fast, you're wasting your time. And so this was what was accepted. Now we had two things that emerged during this rapid rollout. One was in the initial phases of testing the system. The IT guys' ideas, and we're going back a long time, it's not a critical problem, but they had nothing to go on. they designed to a 5-second response time on the terminal. And as far as the user was concerned, it was dead. User behavior, forget it. So they had to redesign to sub-second response time, which was a bit of a shock to them. But it was a great learning curve. The other thing was, how do you train 5,000 people in a year to adopt a new system? And the approach was, in UK industry terms, quite revolutionary. The first training course was given to the management committee. Okay? Then each of them went with their subsidiary directors and did it again. And then it was rolled out. No one could say, I am too busy or important not to do my training. It was very clever. Tony Cleaver. That was one of Cleaver's insights. And so it went out and it worked very well. But we so nearly got it wrong. I have to say that. But there was a lovely unexpected outcome. Because as executives, you spend a lot of time visiting customers. That's still part of the ethos. You had a great talking point. Oh, they loved just saying, we nearly dropped the ball on this one. Because they said, you mean there's a better way? Oh yes, if you do this, that and the other, you'll get a... And we got a large amount of office systems business on this almost bad mistake. So a bit of luck, really. But it proves that sometimes innovation can come from the top. Very often it comes from the bottom if it's allowed to come through. That particular one came from the top in terms of the rollout. Moving on a bit with IBM, it got into trouble, as pretty well known. This is a very cursory view. There's many more complex issues. It was certainly overweight in traditional manufacturing, and it needed large-scale restructuring. There was the effect of this was job displacements. Jobs no longer required on the broad front, and we needed large-scale restructuring. I was called back to Paris to work, just a very small group of us, the three of us. Guy who then went on to be president of IBM Europe, myself and another guy, to do a European strategy for moving heavily into the service industry, so it included consulting, outsourcing, all aspects you can think of. We've already got education, we've got systems integration style work by them, and the customer engineering, of course, the guys who fix the machines, but we had to broaden it out. And then I was given the job to go to the corporation in Almond and present this to the group management committee, the European proposal, which was effectively adopted as the corporate strategy. And I hadn't heard of what they'd seen from the Americans, but it was obviously a great experience. And so the restructuring came along, and I became the UK General Manager for the software and services elements. So the old marketing and services have now gone. It used to be always a combination. Now the sales guys were separated, if you like, from the services. And as I say, there were serious employment issues, and some of which we couldn't solve. For the first time in existence, IBM had to lay people off. And that was really challenging, because we've been brought up to believe you don't do that. So, not always great stuff, but then came along Mr. Gerstner, first external appointee outside, which again was a very rare for IBM, very rare. He had a McKinsey background, and they are very much on a line of business industry approach to their consultancy. So he thought he'll reform IBM into global line of business, which he did. And this meant a significant reduction in the country role, because you can't have both, because we, so I got put into this new structure, we were profit centres. You couldn't have two people arguing about profit. It's one of the problems with a matrix organisation. How you manage these trade-offs is very difficult. Anyway, you have to have a leading edge of the matrix. That's the way. You can't leave it to float and find its level. Someone has to be in the lead. And with a new structure, we were in the lead. It's the only way it worked. And so we had a government business worldwide, so with units in South America, Australasia, etc. And I was appointed, the American guy was the line of business general manager. I was asked to be general manager for Europe, Middle East, Africa in this sphere. And but typical IBM, specifically as his deputy as well, because if there were an issue that meant going to the corporate office, he couldn't send his chief of staff. I had to get on a plane and go over there. That's the mentality of the company. Didn't happen very often. But then I learned another concept from this with major shake-up, if you're in this situation. There's about a 2-year window to make change. Yeah? It doesn't go on forever. The corporate amoeba grows back. The control freaks find a way. And before, you've got about 2 years to innovate. But you can innovate. You can innovate in big organisations. The early model showed, because of the delegation, I could innovate as a branch manager. Some of them were right, oh, fair enough, that's the risk you take. Here we were innovating as part of corporate policy, so both ends of the spectrum. Unfortunately, we're now into about 1966. I had a nasty incident, ended up in A&E and one down from intensive care, whatever they call it, anyway. And in a sense, that paid my IBM career. I reached a level where international travel was a built-in part of my existence, and IBM were very good. They did their best to minimise travel, but it's quite clear that it's not a long-term solution. So I had to make the decision it was time to part from IBM. So I did, and then I moved into a portfolio of things, and one of which was BCS. I was in a dinner, one of them, fancy dinners, with Ian Ritchie, who was the then president, and Judith Scott was the Secretary General, I think we called her then, or Director General or something. And I said, as you do, keep your mouth shut. Oh, I've got more time now. Anything I can do? Within about a week, I've replaced John Leafield on one of the advisory committees. And then, not long after, I was asked to be Vice President of External Relations. This was the institutional background then. Ex-presidents around the room may remember some of this, I'm sure they do. The membership issues, finance issues, the office was set up was really no longer fit for purpose even then. We had a particular image with IT, and our public image was pretty poor, the industry as well as us. So another poison chalice, volunteered for. The membership issue was interesting. We were losing student members when they became graduates. There was a lack of smooth pathway to corporate membership. And this was a side effect of the Engineering Council membership. Now, I don't cry all the work that got us to be allowed to be CEng, but it also was a barrier. And this barrier came to the fore in two ways. One was partly linked to my brother, who I mentioned him. I heard through him, the English Institute have faculties, a bit like specialist group, active in the profession. They had 7,000 or 8,000 accountants in their IT faculty. 7,000 or 8,000. We had 35,000 members, including students. And of course, they were much bigger than us. They were compulsory registered profession. And it struck me, you can't argue these people are not charterable material in the long run. You've just got to define what the charter means. And then the second one was the IE. Now, the IE were going through their let's sweep up the technology industry strategy. And Wendy Hall was now president, and I was deputy president. And we had a meeting with David Brown. So David Brown, who was the then president, and Sir John O'Reilly, in the afternoon as it happened. Nice place to have such a discussion. Because they wanted us to join this new club they were forming. And we said no for two reasons. One, we've only recently gone through the process of getting our members to agree to our own restructuring, the ballot of all the members, the new Royal Charter, etc. And the second one was, the whole raison d'etre of this was to extend our franchise as a professional body. Not just because we felt we needed more members, but we felt it was absurd. There was a whole kludge of professionals who our then rules were precluding from professional entry. So we said, we're certainly not going to do it for time reasons, and we're not going to do it for philosophical reasons, but we wish you well, because we always had a good working relation. They rushed it, and it bounced right back in their face. If you remember the history, they had to go back and do it all over again. We maintained our relationships, but now, of course, we license them for CITP, which is quite a nice back circuit. but we needed our own chartered qualification, and its roots were in this. That's all I'm going to say on that, but there was a membership bottleneck, and then, because of, I guess, my corporate background, I happened to also be chairman and other things I was now doing of a company that fitted out technical premises, etc. We needed to get rid of Mansfield Street, and we needed another location, and we had problems with Swindon as well, which I won't go into all the details. So I got involved with Philip Jones, who was the then finance director, and literally we found this place with help from estate agents, etc. And we had a very nice lady who was in the buildings business for us, and we had a choice of two, and we decided on this one. Fundamentally, because of that external walkway allowed us to have this milling structure, and we'd seen it when because we couldn't even run a council meeting in Mansfield Street. We used to go to hotels, and we see this conference layout. So we just plagiarised it. Basically, we said that's what we want, and they had it ready-made in this building, except for one thing: all the balconies were open. Bottleneck. Developers had a bottleneck as well, fortunately, because they wanted to let it as a single let to a corporation, 5-floor let, pretty big let. They realised they couldn't do it. So for nothing, we said, you put the glass up, we'll take the first floor. Of course, once somebody's in, it's easier to let the other floors. No change in the rent, we paid nothing, and we got a very good deal. And it's served the test of time, I think, so far. And it saved the PCS a lot of money, because meetings used to go on in hotels and hired resources, which no longer had to. Swindon, I won't dwell on Swindon, we had to get rid of the old one for all sorts of reasons. We're now where we are in BT. Down the IT was just one thing, which all I did was enable the spend to get rid of it. A very easy decision. We were locked into the supply of the system. We couldn't change one line of code ourselves. We had to call them in as a contractor. Ridiculous. I don't know who'd signed it 10 years before. It had to go out the window. It was totally inappropriate for the thing we were trying to build. Now, all this was alongside lots of other initiatives. This wasn't the only change going on. The marketing stuff, the Charles did, and various others, leading to professionalism campaign. We worked hard, successfully, on influencing broader audiences and government, etc. So this was only the part I got mixed up in. Right. Now, this is the last bit. I think I'm just going to let them know. Why am I talking about ability now? Well, the first thing, if you look at the issues on there, you'll see 3 of them with which I'm closely associated. BCS, IBM, and the WCIT, as it happens. And together with Microsoft and the University of Birmingham, these were the godfathers of this organisation, AbilityNet. I explain what they do. I borrowed some stuff from them, unashamedly. Their ethos is, it turned out that the vast majority of people who are disabled in the workforce are disabled after entering the workforce. So if only you could find a way to remove their bottleneck, then they would have a different life completely. They would have self-respect, they'd be economically viable, and you get a double benefit because they're not depending on benefit systems or whatever else. And so that was what it was after. That's where it started from. Over time, things have changed. The BCS are no longer a corporate member, i.e. voting member of the trustee board. However, there are close relationships still. Could be closer, I'd like to see it, but that's may or may not happen. IBM had a program called IT Can Help through the old disability group. These are volunteer IBMers actually fixing IT problems as opposed to access disability problems in the homes of people around the country. And then IT for Communities was an initiative very similar for WCIT, giving IT support volunteers into charitable organisations. So they all came together a few years ago. I'm just going to go. They have been through the same journey, but just put yourself back 20 years. The way people operated the PC was with a straw or something. You know, you only needed one controllable motor function, and you could now run a computer. And it's moved a very long way since then. So this is now, if you like, rather than organisational, I'm taking a slice of society that's been through a bottleneck to break through, of which our industry has been part of solving the problem, which I thought was rather a nice way, especially as the BCS are very conscious of its social agenda now. So you've gone from the PC to smartphone. Phones are very difficult, the old ones. There was I don't know if somebody was there was a Turing lecture at the IE with a disabled guy who showed how useless a mobile phone was to him. Do you remember that lecture? I remember it very well. It was, the technologists thought they got it, so he could not use it, and he showed why. And it's one of the weaknesses still of our industry is human interfaces. And partly because the people designing and developing and improving them are not conscious of the limitations of the bandwidth of the whole audience. And that's still a problem. AbilityNet earn part of their money through looking at people's websites, allegedly good websites, and finding why they won't work for people with limitations, and telling them how to put it right as a consultancy. So, and there's obviously the most famous probably user of disabled technology is shown there. And then this one, oh, it's gone back, sorry. I don't know why it suddenly started going the wrong way. Excuse me. See if I can get back a bit. I've gone too far. I've gone too far. How often is that, please? The guy who invented this presentation, a guy called Robert Christopherson, he's blind. He goes around with a guide dog, and he gives the most brilliant presentations you could ever see on adaptive technology, because that's what this stuff's called now. And to see him with an Apple Watch running his life is quite incredible. In fact, he's not that old, mid-40s. He got an MBE last year for the services that he was given to this thing. And in the old days, as a blind person, he had all this stuff to carry around just to exist, because he was determined to stay in the workplace. And now you can do it, because I talk to my Google phone now. People think you're stupid, but so adaptive technology has made an incredible difference to a whole piece of society. I mentioned we audit websites, etc., for usability. The other thing we do is assessments, individual or corporate. There are two reasons for this. One is the government would love to have what I call a jelly mold solution for disability, but there isn't one because most people have more than one. And the number of combinations are so high, the idea of a jelly mold is ludicrous if you look at it objectively. Not an answer a politician wants to hear. So, never mind. So, but there's a mechanism why people can get one-on-one assessments with an expert who will provide an appropriate mix of technologies to help them on their way. This is done in workplaces because organisations have an obligation under the various legislations, disability, etc., and to pay for these improvements in the workplace. They thought it was going to be chairs and heights, but it's much more than that. And students have a right to this as well. There's grants available for students to assist their study. And so that's what's taking place within this part of the operation. These are some of the people who have used the services of the organisation. So it's not big, 60 people maybe, but it's hitting hard in the area, which it's we nearly went bust about 5 years ago. We had to borrow money from a charitable lender, thank goodness, to get it back on its feet. Now it's stable. It's an incredibly hard area to fundraise for, can you believe? It's not something that people feel they want to put their hand in their pocket to support. That's why we have to have earning revenue streams to keep it alive. But this is their last. They were lead consultants for the 2012 Olympics on all questions of accessibility for people with impairment. So they punch hard, in a sense they punch above their weight. This is grown out of and is spawned by this industry, and the people overseeing it are from this industry, from BCS, WIT, Microsoft, right across BT are supportive as well, Hewlett Packard being supportive. So I just wanted to finish on that note. because A, it integrates a lot of the organisations I spent my time with, and I still do spend with, so I'm still a trustee. And it also shows that we can look not just at individuals or organisations, we can look at a whole sector of society and apply the same, I hope, proven engineering thing, that you can get an outcome by these methodologies that you would otherwise not get, which is really my conclusion. I think I've been very lucky, to be dropped into things like Concord and then the banking explosion, restructuring, etc. I've spent a lot of my life engineering organisations, but thank goodness I started as an engineer, not an accountant. I've just made it I'm very open to questions. Yeah.
Going right back to the Leo days, you
Yes.
seem to mention the existence of a Leo Bureau at Kids
I thought
Grove.
somewhere, was I wrong? It's Leo something, yeah.
I've never been aware. When I visited Kids Grove in 1962, I saw KDF9,
Right.
that occupied 2 rooms,
All right.
and it wasn't actually working.
All right.
But
Well, we sent our stuff to Kids Grove and we were told it was being processed on the Leo. That may not have been true, because I'm at the wrong end of the pipe to answer this one, unfortunately.
okay,
You may well be right.
I knew 2 people that worked on Leo, by the way.
Yeah. Well, it was, in a sense, because it's the most historic in the commercial world computer, I'd be delighted if it was true, because of my history since then. But if it's not, it's still kicking into the industry. Yes.
Just a comment about Leo, that if there is the Leo Computer
Yes, I
Society,
understand that.
there are a lot of people who would remember these things
Yeah.
and would know whether there was
Yeah, so you might find
that you needed to know
Yeah.
or wanted to know.
Yeah.
There are
Okay.
a big group of people working together
Yes.
who would
Who would
remember
know the
Leo.
answer to
Some
that.
people know the answer.
Yeah.
But maybe now it started out, of course, at Kennedy Hall.
Because we had the talk here from the member of the Lions family not that long ago. There was a yes, Peter.
What was the toughest time you had at IBM?
Oh, when we had to lay people off, unquestionably the most difficult time. As you might guess from now, short straw merchant, that was my job. And I had to leave the UK group, and it was psychologically difficult. Issues emerged. We started a company actually, which was quite successful. I became a director of, because we supported a couple of our directors who were leaving, started this company called Skillbase. And the object was that people who left could sign up to work for Skillbase, and they had contracts from IBM to do certain things. We outsourced the whole of the education function, for example, the internal education. And they could then go off and sell it to other people, because we weren't the only people at that time who had problems, and they were quite successful. So that skill base was one answer. There was also tax reasons. There were over a certain amount. You couldn't go back if you had your money, etc. And it had to be very carefully managed. You could go into a different department or division, but you had to have your books inspectable by HMRC. Having been a tax inspector, not inspector, commissioner, rather different, but in later life, that's their job, and they were doing it. So it was a vehicle to help. But we also learned this, what I call the survivor syndrome. People who escaped the acts, if you like, felt guilty. So we had a big motivational problem with those left behind as well. So it was quite, that's definitely the worst.
You lost the focus at that point.
Sorry?
You lost focus at that point.
We lost people, we lost expertise, we lost a huge amount. Skillbase was a great help because it gave us a legitimate bridge. Because normally, the way it works, these people lost forever, you've got a huge experience gap. Of course, we did have an experience gap, but this ameliorated the gap. So it was a clever device, but it should, we hoped it had never been necessary. In fact, that company was then bought by Bob Robinson, a services company, travel and stuff like that. And I was vice chairman of it for a while when I retired from IBM, and then they assimilated, they restructured into a corporate services division. It didn't stand on its own, so then I parted company with it. Yes?
In your various roles at IBM, was the British computer industry, namely ICL, was that seen as a significant competitor, a thorn in the flesh?
It was seen as a significant competitor very much in the public sector. Although there were pockets of the public sector. This was true around Europe with indigenous companies and IBM alongside each other. There were certain areas where IBM were welcome, frankly, which would go into it, it'd be a bit embarrassing, don't want to embarrass anybody, but there were areas where, in a sense, because of that preference, ICL ended up with a little bit of a short straw, because at the time of the great privatisations of you know, the water, gas, utilities, etc., and their regional structure were formed into operating companies. One of the things we did, I was in the head office, and often I would present to groups coming from, they tended to mix internals and hire some people in, they needed to form a new team, get a strategy. We would talk to them about business planning. They hadn't got a clue, because the way that they were on the receiving end of filling these forms, basically, and it wasn't like that in the commercial world. And we didn't say this is how you do it. I mean, we say this is how we do it, because these are the inputs and these are the outputs. This gave us an amazing contact with all the people running a lot of the new utilities. And unfortunately, probably not for good IT reasons, but for the reasons of the new groups wanting to make their mark, ICL did lose some business. And on top of that, the other people who tried in that space but got it wrong were Arthur Anderson, that existed then, because they decided to design the management system for a privatised utility, and we sent a senior partner in to show how wonderful it was, and then the junior ones, we called them androids, to go in and make it work. They were very bright young gadgets who worked 50 hours a day, but they knew nothing about anything but the template. And that backfired, because the recognition of the individuality of a business, even within an industry set, was one of the byproducts of this IBM Get to Know Your Customer, which I explained the benefits of. So then yes, there were definitely competition. In BAC, it was a mixed supplier. The technical computing for the design side was in 1906, I think it was. It maybe moved up, but that was in the office next door to the commercial systems guys. But the guy in charge of my main client was an aeronautical engineer. He was not an IT man, but he was responsible for the systems, and they happened to be IBM. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
Is your charitable organisation in touch with the Motor Neurone Disease Association?
They are in touch with virtually anybody they can be. They are small, I mentioned that, it's amazing, and they've been growing in the last 2 years, and hopefully more. But there is, the chief executive is in an umbrella body of chief executives of like organisations in disability. So I want to ask the question. You know.
Well, I mean, the reason I ask is that they wouldn't want to subsidise your charity being a charity themselves.
Well,
they do make grants available for people who want to quit.
Well, funny you should say that, because we're in the middle of a strategy process for the charity. And a few weeks ago, I facilitated for them with the management team a rethink strategy. You know, we've done, you know, the famous S-curve theory. We've got to the top of an S. We've got to redo something to move up the next one in corporate development. And one of the things we're looking at is a sort of wholesale retail model where we partner with a bigger charity who have an interest for their groups, but would rather see someone more expert in this sort of thing do it for them. So it's only just come on the agenda, but that's the sort of thing, yes, we are looking at. Yeah.
There was a very interesting speech given at the EDSAT reunion at Cambridge in 1999, when somebody at Cambridge University stood up and said, you know, we've been overtaken by IBM, basically. Yeah. And you know, I think the Atlas, if it was that they were pursuing at the time, you know, had got behind you. Yeah. But the point of me mentioning is that I mean, computing for a long time just had a bad name, just as a non-scientific name. It's not seen as a degree discipline at all. Yeah. And the BCS has suffered in the early days from precisely this. Yeah. I think, and I haven't touched on it, I'm not an expert enough on all the things, but the formation of the academy, and certainly when I was president, one of the things I was very keen on was the different
elements of the organisation should all stand together. So the academic, the industrial, etc., that we were weaker without the whole thing being together, because there was some sort of trivial debate, almost on a pecking order basis, struck me as destructive and not helpful, that we should be strong in all the areas we want to engage. That would be an IBM philosophy. Even there, you've got to be aim to be the best. You might not succeed. If you don't aim, you certainly won't get there. So I agree with your point. Yeah.
Can you confirm or possibly deny my recollection of those 1,000 cash machines put in to Lloyd's, and that is that they were a security disaster because the keypads were mounted vertically, not horizontally. They'd been designed for American drive-by banks, where people just wound down the window of their cars, and you could stand on the other side of the road and watch people put their keypad in.
All the time I was in the branch, bank never ever came to me with that as an issue. Never.
Oh.
Never. No, I can honestly say that.
Oh, I was just a mere customer.
Yeah. No, well, I mean,
but
they may not have been as customer aware because we would only find out through them. I suspect they had some issues because there was a follow-on machine which they assisted with product unit developing in California. There were lots of issues because it was an American rather than British in terms of what it was fit for. Like the thickness of the walls when we originally went, believe it or not, was a big issue. Apart from New York and one or two other big towns, you don't get stone walls this thick to stick a machine in and stuff like that. So there were issues. I know you can laugh now, and there were issues of what happens if the road outside the bank. The first one went in Brentwood. Very soon one went in St Albans, where the general manager of management services, which was the banking title for the guy responsible for this lot, wife lived. And two things: A, she didn't like standing on a slope, nothing you could do about that. But secondly, if it went down, he was the first to know. And the second one to know was the wife of the chairman, because she liked to use it. If her machine wasn't working, the chairman of the bank knew as well. So we had a very short line in terms of problem. But I mean, I can see the problem. Now, of course, we're trying to educate people to avoid. I think the criminal fraternity, we're going back a long time, hadn't quite caught on to how easy this was in terms of any great point. But I have problems with the modern machines, readability of the screens in bright light, for example, they're hopeless. So we haven't learned on human factors in so many ways. You bring out another good example. Yeah.
Another question about CastPoint, actually. So I'm sure you've been asked this question before. I know IBM Hersley, a particular museum there, are very keen to find an example of that first CashPoint. Any clues, any points?
I don't. I was hoping they got one. Because there was one there at one time, we know, because the Queen went there, and John Fairclough, there's a picture of John Fairclough in the company magazine demonstrating the CashPoint. So it was there once. I wish we could find one. Because they went in some other countries, possibly. I did search the web actually for a picture, and I couldn't find one. I could get BAC aircraft 50 years ago, but not a CashPoint.
I think Peter Short might be able to help.
Well, I was hoping that we'll find a way, but it would be nice.
What was claimed in the first these small machines is a Barclay.
Yes, it is. The difference is that the difference in 2984 was not the first cash dispenser; it was the first online dispenser. And both Barclays and Midland shortly afterwards had what they called package dispensers. So you got a 20 quid, whatever it was, and you had a sort of authorised token or some access method that dealt you out 20 quid. But effectively, no doubt, you paid for it when you bought the token. Whereas the big difference here was it was an online transaction through the clearing system, just like a cheque. So the breakthrough wasn't so much that it was that, and that gave you this variable element, and of course extendable to other banking services like you see now. Top up your phone, it didn't exist then, but yeah.
Yeah, there's an interesting corollary to the original cash machines, in that what the Royal Bank of Scotland did was to actually issue you with 30 quid's worth of £5 cards. You've got half a dozen cards with your first statement.
Right.
And you used those, and if they didn't think you were worth 30 quid, they only gave you 4 of them back with the next statement. So it was a little dubious.
But it is interesting because one of the questions is, will people use them? And in the US, they dispensed sort of a voucher with the money to the local supermarket or something, so that, and believe it or not, this was deliberate. They wanted to test how the older generation would get on with them, and they felt, you know, they might be slightly more economic aware, and so they had vouchers presumably loaded the goodies that you could get in that direction to test. So that was one of the elements, which is quite interesting. But all first machines have limitations, don't they? And you learn on the job, really. There's nothing like the early systems. And remember, I left there in end of 1976, so I was only there 2.5 years in that banking branch before I went to Paris. So it was. I'm sure things may have happened after that, which was absolutely true, but I wouldn't know about it. Yeah. Yes.
There is a story, and I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not, that Fujitsu had to redesign their cash machine because when it was either tried out or considered for Europe, it wasn't considered vandal-proof. And this was something that had never occurred to them in their culture, that it would ever be a problem.
Yeah.
Does anybody support that?
I can understand why it's not a problem. I mean, culture and product go closely together, nothing to do with cash points. But corporates, historically it's corporates, GM decided to have a European car called the Cavalier over here. Remember the Vauxhall Cavalier? Yeah. They dictated the initial design spec, it was automatic only. Okay, that was the design spec.
It's all about form.
Yeah, in Italy they'd sell one. And because that was quite a good market for them, because they completely misunderstood the way an Italian driver interacting with his car. Say no more. But this was true. There was absolutely, these are the problems with big corporations, that you can get too far away, and that's why you need tight feedback mechanisms. And to be fair to IBM, you know, a branch office in London could get into the division president for a product if they felt it was right for its customer. And that shortened the lines, but of course the onus is on you at this end, not poor president of the division. But the ethos was, if you said you wanted to do it, he would make time to do it. So you could close the loop. Sorry, was that another question? No? Well, I'm still in the industry. I said plus. I'm the director of the company, started by Anthony at the back there. And that's for a long time now, Anthony, isn't it? Can't think when it started. Still going strong. I'm a trustee.
You outlasted me, David, so that's good.
That's all it has to do. Met your objectives. I'm a trustee of the Delivery Company Trust, I'm a trustee of the Ability Net, and I'm the vice chairman of the governance of London, which is the school in the North East edge of London. Otherwise, I'm semi-retired, I suppose, apart from doing this job. So, thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning of this talk, Rachel said it would be inappropriate for David to introduce himself. We might just have got away with that, but it's still more inappropriate to thank him, to have him thank himself. So it falls to me to do that. In the CCS, we spent quite a lot of time thinking about what happened in the British computer industry in particular, and that part of it became ICL. We hear relatively little about IBM, which is rather a shame, because I'm given to understand that IBM may have made some contributions to the industry. I would finish by remarking, following on from what David just said, some of you may remember the company GT, Plessy Telecommunications, always known as GPT. In French, that would be pronounced J'ai pété, which means I have broken wind. David, it's been a fascinating talk. You've had a wonderful career. And as somebody who spent 40 years avoiding being promoted, I can only stand back in admiration of what you've done. Thank you so much for coming today and for giving us the benefit of your experience. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.